My blood turned to ice when my boyfriend's father sneered, street garbage in a borrowed dress, across the silent dining table. The billionaire's cruel eyes locked with mine, savoring my public humiliation. 23 elite guests held their breath, witnessing my destruction. I rose slowly, heart pounding, a smile forming on my lips. Empires fall with a whisper. Sienna Collins had spent the better part of her 27 years in quiet places, the corners of libraries, the margins of crowded rooms, always observing, rarely stepping into the center. She liked the silence, the reliability of a well-organized archive, the comfort of knowing exactly what came next. So when Aidan Roth, her boyfriend of 11 months, turned to her on a rainy Thursday evening and said, "My father wants to meet you," something inside her tightened. It was not just any dinner. It was the dinner, a formal gala held annually by Richard Roth, the man who controlled one of the largest private investment firms in the country. Every autumn, 23 hand-picked guests, senators, CEOs, media moguls, were invited to dine at the Roth estate in Manhattan. And this year, Richard had extended that invitation to Aidan's girlfriend, the librarian from Baltimore. At first, Sienna had laughed. She was sure it was a joke. "Me?" she asked, her voice light but uncertain. "With all those suits and billionaires?" But Aidan was serious. "He knows about you?" he asked, specifically. That alone was enough to send her pulse racing. She had never spoken to Richard Roth, had never even seen him in person. What could he possibly know about her? The days leading up to the event passed in a blur of nerves and second-guessing. She couldn't afford the kind of dress expected at a Roth gala, not on her modest salary, so she rented one, a sleek navy gown with a low back and delicate beadwork that shimmered under light. It was too elegant, almost theatrical, but it was all she could find that didn't scream, discount rack. Her shoes were second-hand, her clutch borrowed, and her confidence sewn together with invisible thread. They flew into New York on a Friday afternoon. Aidan booked a suite at a quiet luxury hotel near Central Park. He seemed distracted the entire time, on calls, responding to messages, checking updates on his tablet. Sienna tried not to take it personally. After all, this was his world, fast-paced, high-stakes, always one step ahead. She was just trying to keep up. When the car pulled up in front of the Roth brownstone on East 69th Street, her breath caught. The building looked like something pulled from an old film, elegant, enormous, almost royal in its design. The doorman opened the car door, and she stepped out, careful not to trip in her heels. Inside, the air smelled of old money, wood polish, aged wine, and something floral she couldn't place. The foyer was marble and gold, with art that looked expensive simply because no one dared question its worth. She was led through a hallway and into a massive dining room that seemed to stretch forever. At the center, a long mahogany table gleamed under a chandelier the size of a small car. She was the last to arrive. 23 guests turned to look as she entered. Faces she'd seen in magazines and on television. Aidan greeted a few of them, placing a hand gently on the small of her back, introducing her in that effortless, polished way he always had. "This is Sienna," he said. "No last name. No title. Just Sienna." Richard Roth was already seated. He did not stand to greet her. He did not smile. He barely looked at her, but when he did, it was like a switchblade unfolding, precise, silent, cold. Sienna felt it in her spine. He gestured toward the empty seat beside him. The room was warm, but her skin prickled. She sat down, smoothing the fabric of her dress, forcing a polite smile. She could feel the eyes on her, judging, measuring, wondering who the girl from nowhere was and what she was doing at this table. Dinner began with quiet elegance. Champagne was poured. Starters arrived like works of art. Conversation circled around economic forecasts, international politics, hedge fund strategies. Sienna tried to follow along, nodding occasionally, sipping slowly. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and when asked about her work, she responded with brief honesty. "I'm a librarian. Research and historical archives, mostly." A few polite smiles. One raised brow. But Richard said nothing. He watched. Occasionally, his eyes drifted across the table, landing on her with that same surgical sharpness. And then back to his wine, his plate, the next topic. By the time the main course arrived, Sienna was exhausted. Not physically, but socially. It was like holding her breath in a room where everyone else knew the oxygen was only for them. And still, she tried. She asked a question about a recent financial reform bill. One of the senators responded, surprised by her insight. A woman down the table even nodded in agreement. For a moment, Sienna felt herself exhale. Maybe she could survive this night. Then came the laughter. It started with a subtle chuckle from Richard, low and deliberate. He turned his gaze directly to her, cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. The table fell quiet. He lifted his wine glass slowly, held it mid-air, and said, in a voice loud enough for every guest to hear, "Street garbage in a borrowed dress." No one moved. The words hovered, acid in the air. Sienna's heart stopped. Her hand froze around her fork. The sound of clinking cutlery vanished. Silence swallowed the room whole. 23 elite guests held their breath. Richard's eyes stayed on her, unblinking, waiting for a reaction. Savoring it. And Sienna, suddenly, was not cold. She was burning. The silence stretched so long it seemed to fold time in half. Sienna sat motionless, the echo of Richard's words still vibrating in the heavy air, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her napkin. The phrase replayed, not as sound, but as sensation, a sickness blooming in her chest, sour and electric. Around her, 23 people held their postures in rigid discomfort, the pretense of civility crumbling like wet paper in a storm. Someone shifted in their seat. A cough. The clink of a knife gently set down. But no one spoke. No one laughed to defuse the moment. Not even Aidan. Sienna turned her head just slightly, eyes scanning for him, for a flash of defense, of loyalty, of something. He sat across from her, jaw tense, shoulders stiff. Their eyes met for less than a second, and then he looked away, choosing the safety of his wine glass over the wreckage unfolding at the table. The rejection was worse than the insult. She could have left then. Pushed back her chair, walked out, let the sound of her heels be the only answer they would get. But something inside her resisted the urge. Not pride. Not defiance. Something quieter, a refusal to let them dismiss her without truly seeing her. She placed her napkin gently back on her lap and straightened her spine. Her expression remained neutral, but her silence was no longer passive. It was loaded. Across the table, Richard smiled. A small, cruel curl of his lips, like a man satisfied with a successful surgical strike. He turned to a guest beside him, resumed a conversation about market forecasts as if he hadn't just gutted someone alive in front of an audience. The dinner resumed. For the rest of the evening, Sienna became invisible. Not in the gentle way of someone ignored, but in the brutal, calculated way of someone erased. Conversations flowed, courses arrived and were cleared. Occasionally someone would glance her way, quick and guilty, like the echo of a crime they didn't have the courage to witness. But no one said a word. Not even Aidan. By the time dessert was served, her appetite had vanished. She touched nothing. Her hand stayed folded in her lap, her breathing slow, her thoughts looping through every expression on every face around her. These people were the architects of silence. They had learned early that power did not always speak in threats or commands, but in the refusal to acknowledge a wound even as it bled at the tablecloth. The dinner finally ended just before 10 o'clock in the evening. As guests rose from their seats, Richard stood, lifting his glass once more, this time to toast the evening, a hollow gesture wrapped in polished arrogance. The room responded with a muted chorus of agreement, careful applause, smiles rehearsed and empty. No one mentioned Sienna. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her dress, her heart still loud in her ears. Aidan approached, finally, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, like someone trying not to disturb the dead. Sienna stared at him, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. He hadn't stood. He hadn't spoken. He had let it happen. And in that silence, he had chosen a side. Aiden reached for her arm, lightly, just enough to suggest care without committing to it. Let's get back to the hotel. We'll talk there. She allowed herself to be guided toward the foyer. Her heels echoed on the marble as they passed through the gold-framed doorway, through the high-ceilinged hall, past the butlers who held the doors open without meeting her eyes. Outside, the air was crisp and unforgiving. The car waited at the curb, engine low and steady. Aiden opened the door for her, but she paused. She turned. Behind her, the brownstone loomed like a mausoleum of old power. The guests were still inside, still laughing, still clinking glasses over her bones. Richard would forget her name by morning. That much she knew. But she would remember everything. Inside the car, Aiden said nothing. His jaw worked as though forming thoughts he didn't have the words for, or perhaps just lacked the courage to speak. Sienna stared out the window, her reflection half-lit by the passing city lights, her mind racing but outwardly still. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried at all. Even in the moment, even as the shame swept through her like fire through dry fields, her tears had never come. That scared her a little. Back at the hotel, Aiden unlocked the door and walked in first, loosening his collar. "I'm sorry," he said, finally. "That wasn't okay." She remained in the doorway. "That wasn't okay," she repeated, her voice colder than the air outside. "That's all you have?" He turned to face her. "What do you want me to say?" "I want to know why you didn't say anything," she said, stepping inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. "He humiliated me. In front of everyone. And you didn't even flinch." "I didn't want to escalate it," he said. "You don't know my father. If I'd challenged him there." "I don't know your father," she interrupted. "That's the problem. You brought me into his world and left me there to drown." Aiden exhaled, frustrated. "Sienna, you think this is new? You think you're the first person he's done this to? This is how he tests people." "No," she said, her voice sharp now. "This is how he controls people. And you let him." The silence that followed was more honest than any argument. He didn't fight back. He didn't defend Richard. He just looked away. Sienna sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap. She felt small, not because of who she was, but because of how little she seemed to matter in this universe. She had been an accessory, a pawn in someone else's theater, brought in for display, discarded when inconvenient. "Why did he want to meet me?" she asked. Aiden hesitated. Then, he asked if you were serious. "And you said?" "I said I thought you were." That answer landed like a stone in her stomach. "I need some air," she said, standing. "Sienna. No. I'm not doing this tonight." She grabbed her coat and left before he could follow. The city outside was still alive, blinking and humming with energy. She walked without direction, letting the cold bite into her skin, grounding her. She didn't know what would come next. But something had changed inside her during that dinner. Something fundamental. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't even revenge. It was clarity. They had seen her as weak. They had mistaken her silence for submission. They had thought she would shrink and disappear. They were wrong. Tomorrow, she would begin again. And this time, she wouldn't ask for permission. Sienna didn't return to the hotel until after 1 o'clock in the morning. She had walked aimlessly for hours, passing through unfamiliar streets, past glittering storefronts and the soft glow of corner cafes closing for the night. The city had swallowed her, and she let it. In the blur of motion and lights, she had found a strange comfort, in being no one, in not being seen. When she finally stepped back into the hotel suite, Aiden was asleep, still dressed, sprawled diagonally across the bed like he hadn't bothered to undress or fold back the covers. His phone was still in his hand. She paused for only a second before walking silently into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. The mirror didn't lie. Her makeup had held, mostly. The dress still looked elegant. But the girl looking back at her didn't feel like Sienna anymore. Something had fractured beneath her skin, not broken completely, but shifted in a way she knew couldn't be undone. She peeled off the dress carefully and folded it over the edge of the tub. It would be returned tomorrow, cleaned, hung, zipped back into its protective bag. It would vanish from her life like the dinner was supposed to. But she wouldn't let it. By morning, she was already packed. Aiden stirred as she zipped her suitcase, blinking groggily at the light streaming through the windows. "Are you leaving?" "I have work," she said, not looking at him. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "You're not going to talk about last night?" "I think everything that needed to be said already was." "Sienna." "I'm not angry," she cut in, voice quiet. "I'm just done pretending it didn't matter." She left before he could respond, taking the elevator down without glancing back. The doorman hailed her a cab. As the car pulled away from the curb, she leaned her head against the window, watching the city recede behind her. She didn't cry. The emotion she carried was deeper than tears, dense, focused, waiting. Baltimore greeted her with rain. The train from Penn Station had been long and uneventful, and as she stepped off the platform and into the familiar gray of her hometown, she felt the weight of the last 24 hours settle over her shoulders like wet wool. The noise, the voices, the 23 pairs of eyes, all of it clung to her. Back in her apartment, the stillness was a relief. Her cat, Watson, wound around her ankles, meowing in protest of her absence. She crouched down and held him close for a moment, burying her face in his fur. For the first time since that terrible dinner, she allowed herself to feel the ache of humiliation, not as an attack but as an artifact. It had happened. It had hurt. And it would not define her. By Monday morning, she was back at the library. The reference room was her haven, high ceilings, creaky floors, the smell of paper and dust and purpose. Her co-workers greeted her with warm smiles, unaware of the storm she'd walked through over the weekend. That was how Sienna preferred it. No dramatics. No sympathy. She filed away the memory like any other record, indexed, categorized, but never forgotten. But something had shifted. As she sat at her desk sorting through acquisition requests and preparing for a lecture on archival ethics, her mind wandered. Not to Richard Roth's words, but to his eyes. The way he had looked at her, not just with contempt, but with certainty. As if he already knew her limits. As if her silence had confirmed his assumptions. That alone gnawed at her more than the insult itself. Later that afternoon, while reshelving microfiche in the city records section, she found herself flipping through an old property ledger from the early 2000s. It was nothing significant, just routine digitization, but as she scanned the names, one caught her eye: Roth Holdings, LLC. The address listed wasn't one of the known Roth Capital offices or development sites. It was a condemned warehouse near the harbor. She stared at the entry, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the frame. It meant nothing on its own. But the timing was odd. The purchase had occurred during a housing downturn, and the sale price was absurdly inflated for the area. She opened a new search. Over the next few hours, she traced Roth Holdings across multiple entries in the city's property database. Shell companies. Purchases under different subsidiaries. Transfers between entities that, on the surface, appeared unconnected. But the pattern was unmistakable to someone like her, someone trained to see connections buried beneath bureaucracy. By closing time, she had a notebook half filled with addresses, names, dates, and sale values. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew it was wrong. No legitimate firm needed that many layers of obfuscation for properties that never seemed to be used for anything. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, sifting through campaign finance records, charitable donations, city contracts. The Roth Foundation came up again and again, listed as a donor, a bidder, a sponsor. Some events she recognized. others she didn't. But something about the frequency, the lack of transparency, and the sheer breadth of involvement felt off. She knew she wasn't an investigative journalist. She wasn't a whistleblower. But she was good at research. And she trusted her instincts. The 23 stares haunted her, not because they had judged her, but because they had accepted what Richard had said. They hadn't looked shocked. They hadn't looked surprised. They had looked indifferent. Like they'd seen this happen before. She made a list. Names she remembered from that table. She cross-checked each one against public donations from the Roth Foundation. Nearly all of them had benefited financially in some way: board positions, campaign contributions, land deals. It was a web, and Richard sat at the center of it. And she, the nobody librarian from Baltimore, had walked into that room unarmed, thinking it was dinner. It had been a warning. A message. A performance. But what Richard hadn't realized was that Sienna paid attention. She remembered details. She didn't scream, didn't threaten, didn't retaliate. She watched. She listened. And she followed paper trails. By the end of the week, she had created a private, encrypted document linking dozens of questionable transactions across Roth-affiliated companies. Nothing explosive. Not yet. But enough to suggest a pattern, one she was determined to map completely. She didn't tell anyone. Not her coworkers. Not her friends. Not even her mother. She needed more. She needed someone inside. And she had just remembered a name: Benjamin Klaus. She had seen it, once, on the Roth Capital website. Chief Financial Officer. Quiet. Background player. No major press appearances. A paper man. She would find him. Because if the world had already looked at her with 23 silent stares and written her off, she would give them something real to look at. Not rage. Not revenge. Truth. And this time, they wouldn't be able to look away. The internet offered nothing substantial on Benjamin Klaus. His digital footprint was faint, almost carefully erased. There were no interviews, no profiles, no photos beyond a grainy corporate headshot on the Roth Capital website, where he was listed as Chief Financial Officer. Even that listing was buried under several menu layers, as if the company had no interest in publicizing the man responsible for balancing its internal empire. Sienna printed the image anyway. She pinned it to the side of her corkboard, now cluttered with maps, names, and real estate records that spanned 3 states and over 15 shell corporations. Every thread she pulled led her deeper into the labyrinth of Roth Capital's quiet dominion: tax havens, inflated purchases, art acquisitions that never surfaced, and development deals on land that remained untouched years later. She remembered the name Benjamin Klaus because it appeared repeatedly in digital signatures on internal memos leaked during a minor securities inquiry 5 years ago. At the time, Roth Capital had avoided formal charges, claiming internal miscommunication. But in those documents, Klaus's name was never far from the key approvals. His initials always accompanied the most obscure filings, the ones that dealt with large sums routed through vague, charitable initiatives. He wasn't just part of the system. He was the one who made it work. It took Sienna 3 days to find out where he lived. The address came from a quiet listing in a property tax record database. A modest brownstone in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. It wasn't under his name, of course not, but the tax payment confirmation listed a private banking address linked to a P.O. box registered to a now-defunct holding company. She only connected it because she had traced the same holding company in a 2008 Roth property acquisition in Connecticut. Every file she found, every obscure purchase she connected, made one thing clear: Klaus had a system. And now, she was tracing it in reverse. She booked a round-trip bus ticket to New York under a different name. She didn't know what she would say when she saw him. She rehearsed nothing. There was no pitch. She wasn't a journalist or a federal agent. She had no badge, no authority, no protection. What she had was a folder, thick, organized, and damning, and the truth. Or the beginning of it, anyway. Fort Greene was quiet on Sunday mornings, its brownstones flanked by stoops and overgrown ivy. Sienna wore jeans, boots, and a charcoal gray coat, blending in with the rhythm of the city. She found the address easily. The building stood at the end of a tree-lined street, modest but well-kept. The buzzer panel was cracked and unmarked. She hesitated only once before pressing the button. Nothing. She pressed it again. After a long pause, a voice crackled through. Male. Sharp. Guarded. Yes? Mr. Klaus? She asked, adjusting her voice to sound firm but not aggressive. My name is Sienna Collins. I need 5 minutes of your time. I'm not press, and I'm not here to sell you anything. There was a long pause. I don't do door conversations. I didn't come unprepared, she said. I think you know the Roth Foundation isn't what it claims to be. I have documentation that connects shell entities under your management to fraudulent property deals. Another pause. The intercom clicked off. Sienna stepped back, heart pounding. She'd blown it. It was a long shot, and she knew it. But then, the door opened. Benjamin Klaus stood in the narrow doorway, wearing an old cable-knit sweater and dark jeans. He was older than she expected, early 60s, maybe, with thinning gray hair and a face that seemed carved from quiet caution. His eyes, however, were sharp. Not surprised. Not panicked. Just wary. You have 30 seconds, he said. Sienna held out the folder. He didn't take it. He stared at her instead. I'm not trying to blackmail you, she said quickly. I know what you're thinking. But I don't want money. I'm not here for revenge. I was humiliated by Richard Roth at a private dinner last week. It opened a door I didn't know existed. Now I'm standing in it, and I want to know what's inside. That gave him pause. Klaus looked her up and down, not in judgment, but in calculation. Then, with a sigh, he stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's it. She followed him inside. The apartment was neat, almost sterile. Bookshelves lined the walls, full of economic texts and political theory. No personal photos. No decorations. A desk sat in the corner, covered in papers stacked with surgical precision. He motioned to the table. Put it down. She did. He opened the folder and flipped through the documents with quick, practiced movements. After less than a minute, he closed it and looked at her. You're either very smart, he said, or very reckless. Maybe both. He leaned back in the chair, hands folded. You realize you're poking something much bigger than you can see. I do now. And what do you want? Truth, she said. Accountability. And answers. He scoffed. You think the truth matters in this world? She didn't respond. You're not the first person to try, he added. But most stop when they realize how many hands are in the till. I don't scare easily. He nodded slowly. That's what worries me. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Klaus leaned forward and tapped the folder. Everything you've gathered here is real. But it's surface level. It's enough to get attention, not enough to survive the attention you'll get. Then help me, she said. Tell me where to look. He exhaled sharply. For the first time, she saw something behind his eyes, fatigue. The kind that comes from years of knowing too much and saying too little. I have documents, he said slowly. Internal audits. Signed letters. Wire transfers. If I gave them to you, you'd be sitting on a time bomb. And Roth would know within days where the leak came from. You're about to be pushed out anyway, she said. The restructuring. It's already public record. Klaus gave a bitter smile. So you really have been watching. I want to burn the rot, she said. Not for revenge. For something bigger. I know what he did to me was personal. But what he's doing to this country, to our systems, is a cancer. Klaus looked at her for a long moment. Then, finally, he stood and walked to the desk. He unlocked a drawer, pulled out a small black flash drive, and set it on the table. Everything you need is in there. But I'm not the story. You are. Sienna stared at the drive. You have no protection, he warned. Once this comes out, your life changes. You lose your job. Your privacy. You'll be labeled a liar, a disgruntled girlfriend, a bitter outsider. You'll be investigated harder than Roth ever will. I know. And you'll be alone. I already am. He pushed the drive toward her. Then make it count. She took it. Outside, the Brooklyn wind had picked up. The streets were busier now, the quiet of morning replaced by traffic and voices and movement. But everything felt slower. Heavier. The flash drive in her pocket felt like a stone, not just in weight, but in consequence. This wasn't just about Richard Roth anymore. This was about power. About systems. About silence. And she was done being silent. Sienna returned to Baltimore with the flash drive hidden in the lining of her coat, tucked beneath a stitched seam she'd opened the night before. She hadn't told anyone where she had gone or why. No text messages. No updates. Not even to her mother, who had learned long ago that Sienna's silence was never an absence but a calculation. Something was unfolding, and Sienna wanted no witnesses until she understood it herself. Her apartment felt colder than usual, as if it sensed that what she had brought home didn't belong to the ordinary world it had once sheltered. She placed her coat carefully over the back of the chair and turned on only one light, the soft lamp above her desk. The flash drive, small and matte black, seemed unassuming in her palm. But it burned with a weight that wasn't physical. She booted up her laptop, disconnected the Wi-Fi, and opened a virtual machine, an isolated sandbox environment she'd only used once before, during a university project on cyberforensics. That night had been theoretical. Tonight was real. The folder on the drive was encrypted, but not heavily. Benjamin Klaus had assumed she'd be competent enough to bypass simple protections. Inside were 4 main directories, each dated and labeled with single words: Foundation, Contracts, Assets, and Legal. She started with Foundation. The documents inside painted a different image of Roth Capital's philanthropic wing, not the glossy charity empire seen in interviews and press releases, but a network of strategic money laundering fronts. The files detailed disbursements to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama, routed through non-profit shell organizations. 1. Future Steps Alliance had received nearly $9 million in Roth Foundation grants over 3 years, but the physical address listed belonged to an abandoned building in Queens. She cross-referenced the board members. 2 were political aides. 1 was the spouse of a senior SEC official. And 1 had been seated at the dinner table that night. Her stomach tightened. Moving into the Contracts folder, she found internal memos between Richard Roth and various municipal officials. The files were scans of faxes, physical letters, and digital signatures, evidence of bid rigging, zoning manipulation, and covert lobbying. 1 thread stood out: a 3-year negotiation over waterfront development rights in Maryland. The land had been acquired through a Roth-owned front company at less than half market value, then flipped with inflated investment to a government project. Public records showed the project had been marketed as a revitalization effort for low-income communities. None of the promised housing had been built. The profit margin, $26 million. The Assets folder was next, and it was damning. Spreadsheets outlined hundreds of personal and corporate purchases, artwork bought anonymously and resold through Roth-affiliated galleries, land acquired through intimidation of private owners, even massive life insurance policies taken out on senior executives who had died under vague circumstances. The metadata on the files was recent. Klaus had updated them as recently as 2 weeks ago. Sienna sat back, her hands motionless on the edge of the desk. The walls around her seemed closer now, like the truth inside the flash drive had pushed the world inward. But it was the legal folder that made her breath stop. 1 subfolder. 1 document. A scanned letter on Roth Capital letterhead. It was addressed to the District Attorney of New York, dated just 5 months earlier. In it, Richard Roth outlined a potential cooperation deal involving a rival firm under federal investigation. He offered documents, statements, and insider access, not out of civic duty, but in exchange for continued non-disruption of Roth Capital philanthropic endeavors and strategic investment operations. He had bought silence with other people's crimes. Sienna stared at the signature at the bottom. It was Richard's. Neat, elegant, confident. The man had offered someone else's downfall in return for his own immunity. And it had worked. She closed the laptop slowly, her mind churning. The scale of the corruption wasn't just staggering, it was systemic. This wasn't a single villain hoarding wealth behind iron gates. This was influence bought in bulk, traded like currency, protected by people in every corner of power. And still, the question remained, what would she do with it? Turning it over to the authorities was an option, but who among them wasn't already touched by Roth's shadow? Journalists? Perhaps. But even that would require a level of strategy she didn't yet possess. She needed time. A plan. A way to let the truth explode without her being erased alongside it. For now, she would observe. Watch how the pieces moved. See who was connected to whom. The drive was just the beginning. She knew that now. The next day, she requested 2 weeks of personal leave from the library. Her supervisor, a kind woman named Elaine, raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. Everyone needs space now and then, she said. Go recharge. Sienna didn't argue. She began working from home, creating backups, drafting anonymous tip packages, encrypting copies, sending them to remote cloud servers under false names. She activated a burner email and began contacting reporters known for whistleblower work, carefully, one by one, with vague but enticing information. One reply came in just 2 days later. A man named Ronan Adler, investigative journalist with The Ledger, a financial outlet known for unflinching reporting on corporate abuse. He was cautious, but interested. You have something real? He wrote. I do, she replied. Then let's meet. They agreed on a neutral location, a bookstore cafe halfway between DC and Baltimore, quiet, frequented by academics and retired professors. No press badges. No cameras. Just a meeting. She arrived 10 minutes early, dressed simply in dark jeans and a beige turtleneck, her coat long enough to hide the nervous tremor in her hands. Ronan arrived exactly on time. Late 30s, clean-shaven, deliberate in his movements. He scanned the room before sitting. You're Sienna. I didn't give you my name. You didn't have to. I do my homework. He didn't smile, but there was no malice in his voice. I have proof, she said, sliding a slim USB drive across the table. But it doesn't leave with you today. You look through it here. Then we talk about what happens next. He nodded. Pulled out a laptop. No argument. Just action. For the next 45 minutes, the only sound between them was the low hum of cafe chatter and the quiet tapping of keys. Ronan's face remained unreadable. Every so often, he would lean closer to the screen, frown, highlight something. When he finally closed the laptop, he looked at her with a mixture of something between alarm and respect. You understand what this is? He asked. Yes. You understand what happens if we publish it? She didn't answer right away. I understand what happens if we don't. He sat back. This isn't a leak. It's a wrecking ball. You'll be targeted. I already was. Ronan tapped the drive once with his finger. This changes everything. Sienna exhaled. That's the idea. The meeting with Ronan Adler had left Sienna both electrified and unnerved. He hadn't promised anything, not publication, not protection, not even faith in her motivations, but his final words had lingered as she rode the train back to Baltimore. This changes everything. She didn't need validation, but hearing it from someone who had spent his career dismantling giants gave her resolve sharper edges. Back in her apartment, she reorganized the information on a private drive, created a set of detailed notes for Ronan with context and citations, and drafted a possible timeline for release. She didn't trust even encrypted email to send it, but she had agreed to meet him again in 4 days. That was enough time to prepare, and enough time, she hoped, to stay invisible. But staying invisible was no longer an option. By Wednesday afternoon, Sienna noticed it, subtle at first. A white sedan parked across from her building 2 days in a row. The same man buying coffee at the same corner bodega every morning, never looking directly at her. Her social media login suddenly prompted security verifications despite no password changes. Then, a missed call from an unknown number, followed by silence. They were watching her. Whether it was Roth's people, government surveillance, or a private intermediary hired to sniff out leaks, she didn't know. But the timing wasn't coincidental. Someone knew she had something, even if they didn't yet know what. She shut everything down, phone, internet, backups, and returned to analog. She purchased a prepaid flip phone and made handwritten notes. The flash drive stayed in a small fireproof safe beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. But as careful as she was, one variable remained outside her control. Aiden. He had been quiet since she left New York. She hadn't responded to his 2 texts or his single voicemail, a hesitant, confused message that sounded more like an apology rehearsed and abandoned mid-sentence. But on Thursday morning, a knock at her door startled her awake before sunrise. She looked through the peephole and froze. It wasn't Aiden. It was Benjamin Klaus. She opened the door slowly, every alarm bell in her mind sounding in unison. He was dressed in a dark coat and gloves, holding nothing, face tense. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "But you need to know something." She stepped aside, and he entered without ceremony, his eyes darting briefly around the room as if expecting someone to follow him. He didn't sit. "They know about Adler," he said. "I have friends in compliance who intercepted a tip to Roth's legal counsel. They don't know your name, not yet, but they know someone gave Adler something explosive." "How?" "Because Adler made a query to a Roth affiliate 3 days ago. Too soon. Too direct. He asked about an offshore subsidiary. It triggered an alert." Sienna's stomach dropped. "He didn't tell me he'd reached out to anyone," she said. "He probably didn't know it would be flagged. But now Roth's people are hunting. They're reviewing everyone he's met with in the last 2 weeks. You're on that list." "I was careful." Klaus shook his head. "Careful isn't good enough anymore." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a printout from an internal company system. Sienna recognized the header from the folder he'd shown her days earlier. "They've narrowed it down to 3 suspects," he said. "You're one of them. And they've started surveillance. I noticed." Klaus looked her dead in the eye. "You need to disappear. I can't just walk away. This isn't about pride. It's survival." She paused. "What if I escalate? To whom?" "To the press. More outlets. All at once. Flood the system before they can contain it." He hesitated. "If you go public now, they'll bury you under lawsuits before the story lands. Discredit you. Drown you in noise. Unless someone stands beside me." He said nothing. "Someone from inside." Still nothing. "I'm not asking you to destroy yourself," she continued. "But you gave me that drive because you know what he's done. And you're running out of time to decide if you're part of the solution or just a footnote in his machine." Klaus rubbed his face, suddenly looking years older. "I wasn't supposed to last this long," he muttered. "I thought they'd replace me after the last audit. But they kept me on. Probably because I know too much." "Then make it count," she said. He walked to the window, looked out briefly, then turned back. "There's one more file. I didn't include it on the drive." "Why?" "Because it's not data. It's personal." "What is it?" He hesitated. "Your mother." The room fell still. My mother? Klaus nodded. Years ago, before you were born, Richard Roth was involved in a land acquisition in West Baltimore. Eminent domain, forced evictions. Your mother was one of the tenants. Sienna's lips parted, but no words came out. She filed a complaint. Refused to leave. Delayed the project for months. Roth sent lawyers, pushed her out eventually. But she wrote letters, one of them made it to a state attorney's desk. It was buried, but not before it triggered a minor inquiry. That's how your name showed up in his radar. She sat down slowly. You think this dinner, this insult, it was connected to that? He never forgets opposition. No matter how small. Your mother cost him 6 months and a public reprimand. And now her daughter is at his table? You weren't just a nobody. You were a message. Sienna stared at the floor, heat rising in her throat. He had known. All this time. Who she was. Where she came from. He had known before she even stepped through the door. I want the file, she said. I'll bring it tomorrow, Klaus replied. But if you're going to do this, you need protection. Real protection. Then help me get it. He looked at her for a long time. I might know someone, he said finally. A former Roth security contractor. Disillusioned. Dangerous. But clean. What's his name? Klaus reached into his coat again, pulled out a business card, unmarked except for a handwritten phone number on the back. Call this. Use your burner. Don't mention names. Just say you're a friend of the accountant. He walked toward the door, then paused. You understand what's coming, right? She nodded. This isn't a scandal, he said. It's a war. Then I guess it's time to choose a side. Sienna waited until after midnight to make the call. The burner phone sat in her hand for nearly an hour as she paced the apartment in total silence, Watson curled on the couch, watching her with the stillness only cats and trained assassins seem to master. The handwritten number Klaus had given her offered no clues. No name. No location. Just digits and the brittle trust of a man with everything to lose. She finally sat at her desk, lit a single lamp, and dialed. The phone rang once. Then twice. On the third ring, a voice answered, male, quiet, deliberate. Yeah? I was told to call this number, she said. Friend of the accountant. Another pause. Then, what's your situation? I'm being watched. I have something they want to keep buried. And I need someone who understands what I'm up against. You're being followed right now? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. Then don't say anything else. Listen carefully. Walk to the intersection of Fayette and Charles. There's an all-night diner. Sit in the back booth near the restroom. Order coffee. Nothing else. Wait 20 minutes. The line went dead. Sienna stood quickly, threw on a coat, grabbed the burner, and walked out the back stairwell. The streets were cold, wet with rain that had just started to fall again, thin sheets of it gliding across her face as she made her way through the nearly deserted city. The diner was familiar, a rundown silver and chrome relic that hadn't changed since the 80s, its neon sign humming faintly above the door. Inside, it smelled like old grease and burnt toast. A server barely looked up as she walked to the back, slid into the booth near the bathroom, and ordered black coffee. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. At 25 minutes, the door opened. A man walked in, late 40s, clean-cut, stocky but agile in his movements. He wore a plain navy hoodie, jeans, and running shoes, the kind of clothing designed to be forgettable. He didn't look at her as he slid into the booth across from her and placed a newspaper on the table. You brought it? No names, he said, without looking up. Not now, not later. And no, I don't have it. I don't carry what I don't trust. Then what do you need to trust it? He scanned the room once. Then his eyes met hers, level and calm. You have proof? Yes. Real proof, not theory. Not speculation. Files. Documents. Internal records. A cooperating witness. He sat back slightly. Then you need to stop moving like an amateur, he said. You were followed here. 1 block back, silver SUV. Same one that's been circling your building all week. Her throat went dry. How do you know that? Because I've been watching them. Klaus called me 3 days ago. Said you'd probably make contact. I started looking into your situation. You're in deeper than you think. I know exactly how deep it goes. No, he said, voice low. You really don't. Roth isn't just protecting a company. He's protecting leverage. The kind that doesn't get printed in exposés. The kind that rewrites elections. She said nothing. Once your name goes public, he continued, it's not just threats and lawyers. They'll discredit your job, your family, your personal life. The people at that dinner? Half of them have media ties. The other half own the media. I'm not backing down. Good, he said. Because now it's too late anyway. He tapped the side of the newspaper once. I can help you. I can keep them off your back long enough for the story to break. But I don't work for free. I don't have money. I don't want money. Then what? I want what's on that drive. A copy. I want to know what I'm protecting. Sienna stared at him. I don't even know your name. You never will. But if you want to walk out of this without disappearing into some legal hole in Nevada, you'll have to trust someone. Might as well be the guy already risking his life for free. She hesitated, then nodded once. Give me 1 day, she said. You'll get your copy. He stood. Next time, don't use the front door. And ditch that burner after this call. He walked out. Sienna stayed for another 10 minutes, her coffee untouched. By the time she made it home, the silver SUV was gone. The next morning, she received a message from Ronan Adler, a secure channel she'd agreed to monitor. No words. Just a single image, a front-page layout draft. It was a mock-up for an exclusive feature. The headline was blank. But beneath it was her photograph, a still image taken from a public panel event she'd spoken at 2 years ago, part of a local history conference in Baltimore. She was mid-sentence, eyes steady, hair pulled back. The caption simply read, "The librarian who unraveled an empire." She blinked twice and looked away. She hadn't given him that photo. Someone else had. She closed the tab. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Klaus returned. This time, he looked haggard, less composed, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't ask to come in. He just handed her an envelope. Inside were 6 pages, photocopies of a case file she'd never seen. Her mother's name on the first page. Filed against a now-defunct Roth acquisition company. Multiple notations, reassignments, and finally, a dismissal signed by a city clerk whose name she didn't recognize. But tucked into the back of the file was a typewritten letter addressed to an assistant state attorney. The last line burned into her memory instantly. I refuse to be silent, even if the price is my home. Sienna's hands shook as she read it. She had never known. Klaus watched her for a moment, then said quietly, she fought harder than most. And she paid for it. People like Roth make sure of that. Sienna looked up. He remembered her. He remembers everyone who ever said no. She folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and looked at him. Then it's time he heard it again. By nightfall, she had sent the final draft to Ronan, a complete data set, backed by annotated research, accompanied by an anonymous statement. She asked him to hold off for 72 hours before publishing. In the meantime, she would vanish. She met the unnamed contact in a parking garage just outside the city. Handed over a hard copy. Gave him a list of fake social media accounts that had already started trolling her anonymously. He nodded without speaking. Drove off in silence. And just like that, the disclosure had begun, quiet, methodical, irreversible. No press conference. No podium. No hashtags. Just a whisper. And the sound of empires shifting. The storm didn't come the next morning. It arrived that same night. The first sign wasn't loud, it was clinical. Sienna received a call from the Baltimore Public Library's HR department just before midnight. An apologetic voice, dry and rehearsed, informed her that her recent leave had triggered an internal audit regarding her employment records. Specifically, a discrepancy had been flagged concerning a grant she had applied for 2 years prior. She was informed, politely, that she was being placed on temporary administrative leave, pending a formal investigation. The call ended before she could ask a single question. She sat frozen at her desk, the words replaying in her mind like the echo of a gavel in an empty courtroom. She didn't need to be told what was happening. They were moving. And they were starting with her foundation. Within the hour, her email account at the library was suspended. Her staff login credentials were revoked. By sunrise, several posts appeared online from anonymous accounts accusing her of professional misconduct, referencing the grant irregularity as if it were long-standing knowledge. They used her full name, her face, her title. But none of them linked to verifiable sources. It didn't matter. Perception was their weapon. Silence, their shield. The second front opened when Aiden showed up at her door. She didn't answer at first. She watched him through the peephole, unsure of what version of him she was about to encounter. When he knocked a third time, she finally opened the door. He looked different. Paler. Eyes sunken. His once flawless composure was cracked around the edges. "Can we talk?" he asked. "About what?" "About what you're doing. About what you're trying to burn down." Sienna leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You had nothing to say when your father humiliated me," she said. "Now you want a conversation?" "I didn't know," he began, but stopped himself. "I didn't know how far you'd take it." "Far enough to make him nervous." "He's not just my father, Sienna. He's a wall. People don't climb him. They crash." She stepped back. Then maybe it's time he met someone who knows how to bring down walls. Aiden stepped into the apartment without asking, his presence filling the space with unease. "I'm trying to warn you," he said. "He knows. About Klaus. About Adler. About the files." "Let him know," she replied. "Let him know everything. You think this is justice? You think exposing some documents will make a difference? It already has." He laughed bitterly. "You're being naive." "No," she said. "I was naive when I thought you were different." Aiden looked at her, something shifting in his expression, grief, maybe, or something closer to fear. "He's coming for you," he said. "Not with lawsuits. With ruin. I'm not afraid. You should be." She walked to the door, opened it. "I was afraid when he called me trash," she said. "I was afraid when 23 people stared at me like I didn't matter. That version of me died the moment I left that table." Aiden stood there a moment longer, then stepped out. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut behind him. 2 hours later, a new wave hit. An anonymous article surfaced on a fringe news site, accusing Sienna of falsifying her academic credentials. The story was short, filled with half-truths and fabricated quotes from a supposed former professor. No real names. No real citations. Just enough smoke to trigger suspicion. Another post followed, this time on a political blog, with claims that she had been romantically involved with a married city official who funneled confidential documents to her. Again, no proof. No names. Just innuendo wrapped in digital venom. Sienna sat in her living room, laptop open, watching the narrative mutate. This was not about disproving her claims. It was about discrediting her. A war of whispers. She called Ronan. He picked up immediately. I saw it. They're faster than I expected. They had a playbook ready. You hit something raw. Do you still have everything I gave you? Triple copies. All secure. Then publish. I'm not waiting 3 days. You're sure? I'm already drowning. Might as well make it count. He didn't argue. It'll go live in less than 2 hours. Sienna closed the call and turned off her lights. She moved her laptop to the window, positioned it facing the street, and sat back. If they wanted her visible, she'd give them the silhouette. But they wouldn't get the collapse. She waited. An hour and 57 minutes later, the article dropped. The Ledger published the first of what would become a 12-part exposé titled The Roth Network, Inside America's Silent Empire. The article contained the initial documents, annotated with commentary and verified sources. It exposed the fraudulent real estate transactions, the foundation's offshore laundering, and the falsified bids involving public land. It didn't mention Sienna by name, but the narrative centered around an independent researcher with access to internal records. The story exploded across financial and political networks within minutes. By morning, it had reached cable news. Sienna didn't sleep. She sat in silence as the city around her stirred. Her name was still being dragged through the mud in the digital shadows, but now the light had cracked through. That afternoon, Klaus called. You lit the match, he said. Now we see how fast it burns. I have something else, he added. There's a recording. What kind of recording? A meeting. Between Roth and a city commissioner. It confirms bribery. I couldn't send it before, it was on physical media. Where is it now? In your mailbox. Sienna's breath caught. She hung up, walked to the hallway, opened the small rusted mailbox. Inside was a padded envelope. No return address. She opened it, revealing a USB drive and a handwritten note. You don't need a microphone when the walls remember. She plugged it into an old laptop, air-gapped from any network. The audio was grainy, but clear. 2 voices. Richard Roth and a man she recognized from a previous article, a commissioner who had approved the waterfront redevelopment plan. Just make the signature happen, Roth said. Your campaign coffers get a boost. Everyone walks away happy. And the residents? Don't worry about the optics. By the time they notice, we'll be on to something else. It ended there. Sienna stared at the screen. It was enough. She called Ronan. I have more, she said. You're not going to stop, are you? No, she said. Because he's just getting started. The day after the Roth Commissioner recording went public, the pressure multiplied. Overnight, news anchors replayed the audio clip in loops. Political commentators dissected it, asking who else must be implicated. Investigators in local and federal agencies stirred. But the full weight of that recording still hadn't landed, not until Sienna realized that the connections she had traced were far more dangerous than she'd first suspected. By mid-morning, she arrived at her temporary safe house, an Airbnb she'd booked under an alias weeks earlier in a quiet suburb outside Baltimore. She left her apartment behind for the day, cleared out personal items, changed locks, and moved essentials. The silver SUV had been gone when she left. Whether it had returned later, she couldn't know, but she had made the decision. She would no longer remain static. She placed the padded envelope with the USB drive and the recording into a lockbox, then sat with a laptop, coordinating with Ronan and with her unnamed contact, the one Klaus had introduced. The unnamed contact had already started feeding her intelligence, lists of shell entities, offshore trusts, and a network of political operatives implicated in Roth's web. Ronan called. You up for an interview? He asked. Not yet, she said. We need more before the walls close in. Fair, he replied. But they're rewriting the narrative already. They're calling the audio fake, digital fabrication, a setup. Sienna closed her eyes for a moment, then typed replies. Send me every interview transcript they publish tonight. Cross-reference the claims with our data. We'll hit back." They ended the call. She leaned back, letting tension drain into sharp focus. It wasn't enough to drop bombs. She had to redirect the explosion. By early evening, she had a list. At least 5 individuals deeply tied to Roth who, until now, had remained off the radar: a state senator who voted in favor of favorable development contracts, a media magnate whose company had run philanthropy ads for Roth Foundation, a real estate mogul who had sold Roth several parcels at under-market value, a campaign strategist tied to judicial elections, and a lobbying firm that channeled money through Democratic and Republican donors alike. Each name had supporting documents, internal memos, wire transfers, emails, cross-matched registrations in shell companies she'd traced earlier. At 8:15 p.m., Sienna got into the car with her unnamed contact. They drove toward a midtown office building in a bordering county. They parked a block away, walked in through a side entrance, bypassed the lobby's main security by using a pedestrian door the contact had flagged earlier. They carried a small device, a signal jammer, a wireless sniffer, a camera disguised as a pen, all necessary tools for accessing internal files. They reached the 10th floor. The contact led her silently down a corridor until they reached a locked door marked Archive/Admin Records. Using credentials the contact had previously obtained from an insider ally, they bypassed the lock. Inside, the room smelled of dust and old paper. The contact motioned for Sienna to stay back while he scanned a shelf of files. She watched as he removed legal binders labeled with corporate aliases and municipal project names. One he slid out: Criterion Holdings, Roth Development Initiative, 2017-19. Another, Horizon Trust, Donors and Beneficiaries, Offshore Ledger. He passed them to her. She slipped them into a backpack with careful precision. Then she found a third file. It had her mother's name, and underneath, notes about coerced relocation, undervalued land estimates, forced eviction proceedings. But the feared name was on the back page, the same state senator from her list. Hands shaking, she photographed every page she could. They had what they needed. The contact pocketed extra files, and they exited the room quietly. On their way out, the contact paused at a window and said, under his breath, "You realize all this is lobbying, bribery, back-channel money. The moment you publish this, you'll expose everyone above them, and everyone above them." Sienna nodded, throat tight. "We'll be ready." Outside, rain had started. They left the building using the rear stairwell to avoid cameras. When they reached the vehicle, the contact turned to her. "You'll need to be more mobile now," he said. "They're going to try tracing these files to you. Use dead drops. Use proxies. We'll route the leak so your name never appears in the chain." Sienna nodded. "Understood." They parted quietly. She drove back alone, adrenaline coursing, mind already planning the next moves. Back at the safe house, she uploaded the files to encrypted cloud storage, with painstaking segmentation and metadata scrubbing. She then drafted another piece for Ronan, Inside the Web: How Roth Subverted Democracy. She included the new files, the photos, and an executive summary linking them to the recording, the real estate deals, and the network of political operators. She pushed send, and late that night, the Ledger published. The exposé named the state senator, revealed the link between Roth's shell entities and the senator's campaign spending, followed the chain to the media magnate and the lobbying firms. The piece included annotated scans of documents, excerpts of internal memos, and cross-reference timelines. It was a blow so broad it reverberated immediately. By dawn, the senator publicly denied the allegations, called for a forensic audit, and, perhaps predictably, filed a defamation counterclaim. The media magnate's PR team issued a statement saying the Roth Foundation had chosen to give grants to their company as a standard contract, denying any favoritism. The lobbying firms shut down their public operations, claiming internal restructuring. But in the backlash, there were cracks, leaks from inside their own circles conceding small truths, editorial hedges in mainstream outlets, and web searches spiking for Roth Foundation fraud, Roth shell companies, Roth bribery scheme. Sienna monitored it all, heart-pounding but strategic. She hadn't asked for heroism. She had only asked for the truth to be visible. Later that morning, Klaus called again, voice low. "They know what you took," he said. "They've traced a chain of custody, not to you yet, but close. You need a new safe house. I have someone. Arrange it. And Sienna, your contact who helped you with the break-in. I tracked his last known person of trust. If anything happens to him, disappear for weeks. You can't afford someone going down for you. I understand. Be careful," he said. "These connections you exposed, they go deeper than Roth imagined. And now you're in their crosshairs." She hung up and looked out the window. The city below woke slowly, lights flickering, traffic pushing forward. In that dawn, she realized the war had expanded far beyond dinner tables or gala insults. She had touched something living, something so vast that even power wasn't enough to control it. She closed her laptop and stood. The map on her wall, the files, the connections, they all had direction. She walked to the door of the safe house and opened it, letting rain and wind in. She whispered to herself, "Let them come." Because she was ready. The invitation came via encrypted message, short, direct, and unmistakably high stakes. A primetime segment on national television. Live broadcast. A chance to speak, not through articles or intermediaries, but in her own voice. It was Ronan who had arranged it, after weeks of navigating hostile legal threats and bureaucratic stalls. The host was Elise Monroe, known for her sharp interviews and no-nonsense reputation, someone respected even by those whose power she had dismantled on air. The message read, "One-on-one. Full hour. No edits. You control the narrative." Sienna didn't respond right away. She paced the floor of her new safe house, an empty property owned by a friend of Klaus's contact, hidden in the countryside, 2 hours from the nearest city. No Wi-Fi. No cell towers nearby. It was a bunker in everything but name, its isolation both comforting and suffocating. The decision wasn't about fear. She had long passed the point where fear dictated her actions. It was about timing. Precision. The weight of her words would ripple far beyond the television studio. They would shape courtrooms, elections, careers. Her name, until now protected by layers of anonymity, would become a target. She sent a 2-word reply, "I'll come." The network arranged everything. A secure car arrived 2 days later, escorted by 2 unmarked vehicles positioned to monitor trailing cars and license plates. She wore a plain black blazer, hair pulled into a low twist, her face bare except for light concealer under her eyes. She looked neither glamorous nor broken. She looked exactly as she was, tired, composed, and ready. The studio itself was unassuming, a modern building tucked between 2 older towers downtown. She was led through a private entrance, escorted through a long hallway lined with soundproof panels, and into a green room lit softly to relax guests who never actually relaxed. A producer handed her water, explained the sequence of the segment, and asked if she had any requests. "Just honesty," she said. Then Elise Monroe entered the room. Elise wasn't tall, but she walked like someone accustomed to silence following her. Her hair was silver, cropped short. She wore no jewelry. Her eyes were steady, her handshake brief. There were no pleasantries, no attempts to flatter or disarm. Only a quiet moment of shared recognition. "This is your hour," Elise said. "I'll guide it, but I won't shield you. I wouldn't want you to." They walked into the studio together. The set was simple, 2 chairs, a backdrop of cool-toned geometric panels, and cameras positioned with the precision of snipers. Technicians moved around them quickly, adjusting microphones, checking audio levels, confirming angles. Sienna sat down and faced the lens. The red light on the primary camera flicked on. And just like that, they were live. Elise began, her tone measured. "Good evening. Tonight, we bring you an extraordinary conversation. With us is the woman behind the Roth disclosures, a name that, until this moment, remained deliberately protected. Her decision to come forward is hers alone. Her voice, tonight, is unfiltered. Sienna Collins, welcome. Sienna inhaled once and met Elisa's gaze. Thank you. For the next 45 minutes, the interview moved like a current, never explosive, never melodramatic, but steady and unrelenting. Elise asked clear questions. Sienna answered without deflection. She spoke of the dinner, the insult that broke the mask. She spoke of the 23 guests, their silence, the way humiliation had opened her eyes not to personal pain but to systemic rot. She described her work, how public records weren't just bureaucratic footnotes but maps for those who knew how to read them. She named the shell companies, outlined the money trails, cited the audio recordings and legal documents. She mentioned the threats, the surveillance, the digital smear campaign designed to reduce her to a caricature. Elise paused only once. You've lost your job. Your privacy. Your safety. Some would say you've destroyed your own life. Was it worth it? Sienna looked directly into the camera. I didn't lose anything I wasn't willing to risk. And what I gained, truth, clarity, the ability to fight back, that's more than most people ever get. So yes. It was worth it. The final question was unplanned. If Richard Roth is watching right now, what do you want him to hear? The studio was silent. Sienna leaned forward slightly. I want him to know that I'm not the only one. I'm just the first one who didn't walk away. And I want him to understand something. Empires don't fall with gunshots or riots. They fall with whispers. With someone finally saying, no more. A full minute passed before the segment ended. Backstage, the air shifted. Technicians moved slower. Elise gave her a small nod, not of approval, but of respect. No one offered congratulations. It wasn't that kind of night. The ride back to the safe house was quiet. Her contact drove this time. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, watching the dark road behind them. They're going to strike hard, he said. I know. They'll go legal first, restraining orders, disinformation. Then leverage. Family. Past. Anything that cracks the narrative. They can try. The car rolled down the gravel path to the safe house, headlights cutting through mist. Inside, Sienna opened her laptop. Her inbox was already filling, some supportive, others vile. Her face had begun circulating across news channels, thumbnails, headlines. But what mattered most came in the form of a single encrypted message from a sender she didn't recognize. It read, I work for the Treasury Department. I saw your interview. I have documents. Anonymous drop or nothing. I'm not alone. Sienna stared at it. Then, she replied, tell me where. Because now, the dam had cracked. And the flood was coming. The flood didn't arrive in waves, it arrived all at once, crashing through the levees of secrecy with an efficiency Sienna had only hoped was possible. 3 days after her interview with Elise Monroe aired, the anonymous Treasury Department whistleblower delivered. He used a physical drop point, a safety deposit box in a regional bank just outside Philadelphia, secured under a pseudonym. Sienna sent the contact to retrieve it. The box contained a small hard drive and a handwritten letter, unsigned. The letter was brief, these were taken from an internal audit system. No one knows they were flagged. Use them before someone else does. The files were unlike anything she'd received before, tax records, private transfer authorizations, and internal compliance memos with names she hadn't seen until now. They proved that Roth Capital had built its empire not just through shell companies and real estate fraud, but by compromising regulators themselves. Federal employees, some still active, had received consulting stipends deposited into relatives' accounts through Roth-affiliated intermediaries. In exchange, audit timelines were delayed, investigation scopes quietly reduced, penalties minimized. The documents showed at least 7 high-level manipulation events, all traceable, all recent. Sienna catalogued the findings and sent them to Ronan immediately. He was speechless. "This is no longer a corporate crime story," he said. "This is federal." The next morning, the story broke. The Ledger published Part 10, The Roth Playbook, How Federal Watchdogs Were Bought. It ignited outrage. By noon, the Office of the Inspector General had announced a formal investigation. The Treasury Department issued a public statement acknowledging the internal breach. Several mid-level officials were placed on immediate administrative leave. Congress called for a hearing. The world changed. And so did Richard Roth's. Within hours, he was no longer in the shadows. Reporters camped outside his estate. Stock in Roth Capital dropped sharply, 15% in a single day. That same afternoon, 3 key board members resigned. The foundation's website was scrubbed of press releases. The gala calendar was postponed indefinitely. Roth himself did not speak. Not publicly. But he moved. The attack came through legal channels first, an aggressive injunction filed against the Ledger, Ronan, and an unnamed civilian actor engaged in theft of corporate intelligence. The language was clinical, designed to frame the disclosures as stolen property rather than evidence of criminal conduct. But the courts were not as cooperative this time. Sienna had expected this. She had preemptively prepared counter-litigation documents, backed by multiple First Amendment lawyers who had volunteered anonymously once the story gained traction. She was not fighting alone now. The tide had shifted. But Roth wasn't finished. That night, Sienna received a private message from Aidan. "He wants to meet. Just you and him. He says it's not a trap. Just words." She didn't respond. 15 minutes later, another message. "If you don't go, he'll release what he has on your mother. The real file." That was the only message that could have shaken her. She met him the next evening, not out of fear, but resolve. The meeting place was a private estate in Northern Virginia, owned by one of Roth's oldest allies, but currently unoccupied due to the owner's self-imposed exile from media attention. Sienna was driven by the same contact who had stayed by her side since the first leak. He waited outside the gate. Inside, the house was quiet. No lights except in the study. Richard Roth stood behind a heavy oak desk, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, the room silent except for the faint hum of air through the vents. He didn't look sick or shaken. He looked exactly like he did the first night she saw him, collected, commanding, clinical. He didn't sit. "You've caused more damage than you understand," he said. Sienna stood across from him. "Then help me understand." He didn't blink. "This game doesn't end with public opinion. You'll find that out soon enough. You don't scare me." He gestured toward a folder on the desk. "That's your mother's original case file. The one not scrubbed from city archives. It contains letters she wrote after your birth. They're not flattering. You kept them?" "I keep everything." Sienna stepped forward and opened the folder. The letters were real. She recognized the handwriting. But the content wasn't the bombshell Roth thought it was. It was pain, raw, exhausted, sometimes angry. A mother who had been pushed out of her home, isolated, and afraid for her child's future. She was human, Sienna said. "And you want to weaponize that? She wanted to destroy me, and now you're finishing what she couldn't." "No," Sienna replied. "I'm finishing what she started. You just didn't see it coming because you assumed our silence meant defeat." Roth didn't answer. She picked up the file, closed it, and looked him in the eye. "This ends in a courtroom," she said. "You think you've won something?" "I haven't won," she said. "But you've started losing. And you'll keep losing. Inch by inch. Voice by voice. Until there's nothing left to hide behind." He didn't stop her as she walked out. By the time she returned to the safe house, the news had already broken. Federal agents had raided Roth Capital headquarters in New York. Klaus had tipped them off. Investigators had begun interviewing former employees. The Foundation's operations were suspended, and subpoenas were flooding into Roth's network. That night, Ronan called her. "We have confirmation. The grand jury convenes next week." Sienna didn't speak at first. Then, finally, "Tell them I'll be there." It was not a victory lap. It was a turning point. The beginning of the collapse. The empire hadn't fallen with a scream. It had started unraveling with a whisper. And Sienna was far from finished. The days after the federal raid were unnervingly quiet. News coverage reached a fever pitch for 72 hours, clip after clip of agents exiting Roth Capital's New York headquarters with boxes, hard drives, and confiscated servers. Editorials speculated on collapse. Financial experts debated contagion effects. Public sentiment shifted dramatically. Overnight, Richard Roth became a pariah not just in financial circles but in the national conversation. But after the third day, the media machine, always hungry, turned its attention to a new scandal. A tech executive caught in a data leak. A senator under scrutiny for foreign holdings. The attention cycle fractured, and Roth's implosion fell from the top of the news queue, descending into the middle segments and sidebar headlines. Sienna noticed immediately. She wasn't surprised. She had anticipated this moment, the hollow between revelation and reckoning. The world didn't collapse in the middle of chaos. It unraveled slowly in the silence that followed. It was in this silence that the real test would begin, whether the systems that had protected Roth would start stitching themselves back together, or whether they'd continue unraveling under their own weight. She returned to Baltimore under the cover of night. Not to her old apartment, she had vacated that weeks earlier, but to a small rental home on the city's outer edge, near the industrial rail yards. It was temporary. Sparse. A place where she could vanish into normalcy. No press. No flash drives. Just a table, a cot, and time to think. She didn't speak to Ronan for 2 days. Not because there was friction between them, there wasn't, but because she needed space to hear her own thoughts without being pulled into the current of strategy, deadlines, and leaks. When he did call, it was early evening. She answered on the second ring. "You were right," he said. "They're stalling." "DOJ?" "Sort of." The AG's office issued a press release saying they're reviewing the totality of the evidence. It's classic hedging. They've got more than enough, but they're waiting to see how loud the public stays. They're counting on people forgetting. They always do. Sienna nodded, staring out the window. The city beyond was quiet, but not still. People moved. Lights blinked. The world kept turning. "And Klaus?" she asked. "He's disappeared again. I've got a message relayed through one of his safe channels. He's okay. But he won't surface until indictments drop." "Smart." "There's something else," Ronan said. "The Roth Foundation board has released a statement blaming Richard personally for all improprieties. They're attempting a full separation. Damage control." "Exactly. They're trying to spin it like they were victims too. But they signed the documents. They're counting on the public not knowing that." Sienna rubbed her eyes. "It's not enough to expose the rot. You have to explain it to people in a way that they can't ignore. I've been working on something." "What is it?" "A feature. Long form. The whole arc, from the dinner to the documents to the raid. But told through you. No aliases. No anonymity. I thought we weren't doing profiles." "We weren't. But this isn't a profile. It's a reckoning. People need someone to follow. They need a narrative anchor." Sienna didn't answer immediately. "I'll think about it." After the call, she sat alone in the darkening room, listening to the creak of the old wood floors and the hum of a passing train. There was something deeply unfamiliar about the stillness, like stepping onto solid ground after weeks at sea. She had spent so long in motion that the pause now felt unnatural. She woke the next morning to a letter slid under the front door. No stamp. No return address. Inside was a single sentence: "He will not speak again unless you make him." There was no signature, but she recognized the handwriting. Klaus. It was cryptic, but she understood the meaning. Roth had gone dark. No statements, no defense, no appearances. His strategy now was survival through silence. Delay. Legal warfare behind closed doors. He would weather the storm, re-emerge through proxies, and eventually, quietly, begin again. Unless someone forced him into the light. She spent the next 2 days reconstructing a timeline from every piece of evidence she had gathered. Not just a legal case, but a narrative, something irrefutable. She mapped each step: Roth's acquisition of city land, the manipulation of audits, the bribery of federal officials, the laundering through philanthropic fronts, and the intimidation of dissent. She labeled everything. Built a digital dossier with color-coded links, a cross-referenced web of faces, numbers, signatures. Then she booked a meeting. Not with press. With prosecutors. The United States Attorney for the Southern District had opened an investigation weeks ago. They had already collected data from the ledger, conducted quiet interviews with former Roth employees, and were rumored to be weighing indictments. But until now, they hadn't had a comprehensive internal map. Sienna scheduled a secure drop, handed off the encrypted drive with the full framework. Inside was a message: "This is the whole machine. Not just the man." After the handoff, she returned to the safe house and waited. The silence that followed was not the dead kind, it was the kind that precedes something seismic. 3 days later, it happened. The Department of Justice issued a statement of charges: wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and abuse of charitable structures for political gain. And then came the image. A single still photo. Richard Roth, in a tailored coat, hands cuffed behind his back, being led into a federal courthouse. No tie. No entourage. No smirk. The empire had not just cracked. It had collapsed. Sienna stared at the image alone in her living room. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just let out a long breath. It was over. Or, at least, the part of it that had begun with humiliation in a borrowed dress across a silent dining table. The deeper war, against systems that allowed men like Roth to thrive, was far from over. But for the first time in her life, she felt still. Not empty. Not defeated. Just still. The world knew her name now. And the world knew his. But more importantly, it knew what had happened between them. And it had chosen to listen. Months passed. The world had moved on, as it always does. Headlines faded. Commentators pivoted. The Roth scandal that once dominated every media outlet was now archived under notable investigations, filed next to cases that had once held similar weight, now reduced to bullet points in political debates or obscure references in financial textbooks. But in Baltimore, in a small brick building just east of the harbor, Sienna Collins walked into the quiet headquarters of a new organization she had helped build, not a think tank, not a nonprofit, and certainly not a vanity project. It was something simpler and stronger, a watchdog initiative, entirely staffed by researchers, analysts, and community activists trained to follow the money. Its name was understated. One word, carved on the glass at the entrance: threshold. No one called it hers. She made sure of that. It didn't carry her name. It didn't need to. She spent most days reviewing submissions, tips from whistleblowers, contract irregularities flagged by municipal workers, anonymous complaints about campaign finance loopholes. What began as a trickle became a steady stream. After what happened with Roth, people had started believing that systems could be challenged, not with noise, but with documentation, with cold, undeniable evidence. One afternoon, as rain tapped against the windows and the office hummed with the low sound of scanners and printers, a knock came at the door. A young woman stood there, early 20s, student-like in posture, holding a folder so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She looked nervous, but not lost. Sienna opened the door herself. "You're Sienna Collins, right?" I am. The woman stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the sparsely decorated lobby. I saw your interview, she said. With Elise Monroe. It stayed with me. I saved it. Watched it more times than I want to admit. Sienna waited. My name is Leah Marks, the girl said. I'm a junior at Rutgers. Political science major. I've been helping one of my professors with campaign research, and I found something. It didn't look like much at first. But it connects to a firm that, well, it used to be Roth Capital before it was broken apart. Sienna's attention sharpened. Leah opened the folder and laid out a series of financial statements, all tied to a consultancy registered just weeks after Roth's arrest. It had no website, no office, and yet it had already signed contracts with 2 political campaigns. The names involved weren't publicly tied to Roth. But one of them had been seated at the same dinner table that night, nearly a year ago. You think someone's rebuilding it, Sienna said. I think they never stopped, Leah replied. Sienna didn't speak right away. She flipped through the documents again, tracing signatures, routing numbers, formation dates. It was thin, but real. She nodded. Come with me. They walked into the back room, where a long whiteboard mapped current investigations in various states of progress. Sienna added a new column. At the top, she wrote, Horizon Partners LLC. She turned back to Leah. You're not here to be believed. You're here to be heard. That's what matters. Leah smiled, a mix of nerves and pride. Let's begin, Sienna said. In the months since the collapse of Roth's empire, many had expected Sienna to disappear, to write a book, vanish into consulting, become a talking head on television. Offers had come. She declined every single one. Her mother, now retired and living in a small row house on the west side of the city, asked her once why she turned everything down. Sienna had just smiled and said, because I want to build, not talk. And that's what she had done. Threshold was already making waves in city councils across 3 states. It had helped expose a fake veteran housing program in Philadelphia and halted a land swap in rural Georgia that would have quietly transferred protected wetlands to a developer with political ties. None of it made front pages. But all of it mattered. One evening, weeks after Leah's first visit, Sienna received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a magazine. The Atlantic. She turned it over and saw her own face on the cover, a black and white portrait from the night of her interview. The headline read, The Woman Who Whispered and Shook a Nation. She almost threw it away. But instead, she opened it and read the profile. It was fair, thoughtful, and understated. It traced not her triumph, but her resilience. It acknowledged her scars without glamorizing them. It ended with a quote from Elise Monroe, what made her powerful wasn't what she revealed. It was what she chose to do afterward. Sienna folded the magazine and set it on a shelf she rarely touched. She didn't need it. She stepped outside into the dusk. The city buzzed around her, honking cars, distant sirens, life continuing in every direction. She walked without a destination, letting the hum of it all surround her. At a crosswalk, someone called her name. She turned. It was a stranger. Mid-30s. Holding a child's hand. The woman didn't approach. She just raised her hand in a small gesture of recognition, nothing performative. Just the quiet kind of thank you that passes between people who understand something without saying it. Sienna nodded once. The light changed. She crossed the street, wind brushing her coat, her pace steady. Somewhere behind her, systems were already trying to recover, rebuild, hide. But she had built something, too. Something quieter. And quiet things, she knew now, were never weak. They were deliberate. They were patient. They were the whispers that made empires fall.